Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackwood Manor. Hercule Poirot placed the silver letter opener with its customary precision beside the stack of morning correspondence, and regarded the thick cream envelope that lay on top. The paper was heavy, expensive, and embossed in the upper left corner with a crest he recognized at once. A black tower entwined by a serpent devouring its own tail. Blackwood Manor. A name that had drifted across many a London dinner table in hushed, half-amused tones, rather like a ghost story told to children who were old enough to know better. He slit the envelope neatly. Inside was a single card, handwritten in a firm, impatient, masculine script. My dear Monsieur Poirot, I find myself in urgent need of the most discreet observation this coming weekend. Nothing so crude as a murder yet, but a matter that may prove delicate. My guests arrive on Friday. I should be infinitely obliged if you would consent to be one of them. A car will collect you from your flat at 3 o'clock on the appointed day. Yours in confidence, Reginald Hargrove, Blackwood Manor, Shropshire. Poirot's moustaches gave the faintest quiver of interest. Lord Reginald Hargrove was not a man who begged favours. He bought them, inherited them, or simply took them. That he should write with his own hand, and in terms that bordered upon anxiety, was intriguing. The little detective permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. One does not refuse an enigma when it arrives by first-class post, he murmured, and reached for the telephone to inform his valet, George, that a valise would be required. Friday arrived wrapped in thin October mist. The Rolls-Royce that drew up outside 57B Whitehaven Mansions was midnight blue and almost insultingly quiet. The chauffeur touched his cap and opened the rear door without a word. Poirot settled himself among the fawn-coloured rugs, arranged his Homburg on the seat beside him, and gave himself up to the pleasure of watching England unroll beyond the window. Hedgerows turning bronze, rooks quarrelling in skeletal elms, and eventually the dark ridge of the Shropshire Hills rising like a sleeping animal. Blackwood Manor revealed itself only after the drive had twisted upward for a full mile through dense woods of oak and yew. The house stood upon a natural platform of rock, 3 stories of blackened stone with tall Elizabethan chimneys, and windows that glinted like suspicious eyes. Ivy clung to the walls in great shaggy curtains, as though the building were trying to hide from the 20th century. The front doors, oak, iron-studded, older than the Armada, opened before the Rolls had fully halted. A butler of formidable height and perfect impassivity bowed. Monsieur Poirot, his lordship is expecting you. The entrance hall was a cavern of shadows and faded grandeur. Armour stood in alcoves. A vast fireplace yawned beneath a carved mantel depicting a hunting scene so violent that even Poirot blinked twice. But it was the far wall that seized and held his attention. A single immense tapestry, perhaps 20 feet wide and 15 high, glowing faintly in the firelight. It portrayed a stag hunt from some medieval imagination. Horsemen in crimson, hounds with red mouths, and the quarry itself brought to bay beneath a tree, whose branches twisted like agonized fingers. The colours were astonishingly vivid after centuries. The greens still virulent, the blood a wet and shining scarlet. Poirot paused before it, head tilted. Magnificent, he said softly. Flemish, unless I am much mistaken. 15th century. Late 14th, sir, the butler replied, a note of pride creeping past his training. Woven in Arras for Sir Giles de Blackwood, who fell at Agincourt. Family legend claims the huntsman in the centre is Sir Giles himself. Poirot's eyes travelled slowly across the weave, lingering on the tiny, almost invisible stitches that gave life to a falcon's eye, the foam on a hound's muzzle. Something, a flicker of instinct, made the back of his neck prickle. But before he could pursue the thought, footsteps echoed on the stone flags. "Monsieur Poirot, you are kind beyond words to indulge an old man's whim." Lord Reginald Hargrove was tall, lean, and hawk-faced, with iron-grey hair brushed fiercely back, and eyes the cold blue of glacier water. He wore a country suit of Lovat tweed that had cost more than most men earned in a year. His handshake was brief, hard, and over quickly, as though human contact were an inconvenience. "You have a most beautiful home, Monseigneur," Poirot said, inclining his head, "and a tapestry that would make the curators of the Victoria and Albert weep with envy." Hargrove gave a short, humourless laugh. "It has been in the family since the first stones of this house were laid. Come, let me present you to the others before the gong. We keep country hours here." He led Poirot through an archway into a long gallery where a fire crackled, and half a dozen people turned with varying degrees of curiosity. Poirot catalogued them with the swift, merciless accuracy of a man who had spent a lifetime reading faces. First, the heir, Victor Hargrove, early 30s, handsome in the weak-chinned English fashion, with restless eyes and a smile that arrived half a second too late. He was already holding a whisky and soda, though it was barely 4 o'clock. Beside him, in violet silk that clung and shimmered, stood Mrs. Lavinia Trevelyan, widow, reputedly, of a Colombian emerald millionaire who had died inconveniently on a yacht. Her hair was an improbable shade of copper, her laugh metallic. She watched Victor Hargrove the way a cat watches cream. Across the hearth sat Miss Elena Voss, a painter of rising reputation whose portraits had scandalized Mayfair by being both unflattering and brilliant. She was dressed severely in black, with a single string of amber beads, and her gaze upon the company was cool, almost clinical. A thick-set man with a guardsman's moustache and the faint scent of the stables about him was introduced as Colonel Bantry, late of His Majesty's forces in India. His right hand, Poirot noted, trembled very slightly as he raised his glass. Finally, hovering near the door as though ready to bolt, was Dr. Felix Morrow, a thin, nervous archaeologist attached to the British Museum, invited, Hargrove explained airily, because he was writing a paper on the Blackwood Tapestry and its possible Arthurian symbolism. Servants moved soundlessly with tea and sherry. Conversation rose and fell like badly rehearsed music. The weather, the deplorable state of the roads, the probability of pheasant. Yet beneath the politeness Poirot felt currents, swift and dangerous. Victor's smile never reached his eyes when he looked at his uncle. Mrs. Trevelyan's fingers tightened on her glass whenever Elena Voss spoke. The colonel stared into the fire as though seeing old battlefields. Only Dr. Morrow seemed genuinely distracted, his gaze darting repeatedly toward the entrance hall and the great tapestry beyond. At length, Lord Hargrove rose. "Dinner at 8, he announced. "Stevens will show you to your rooms. I hope, Monsieur Poirot, that you find the blue suite to your taste." The butler conducted Poirot up a staircase, whose treads creaked like old bones. On the landing hung another smaller tapestry, this one depicting the death of the stag, its throat torn open, crimson threads spilling across the forest floor. Poirot paused. "Tell me, mon ami," he asked softly, "has anyone ever discovered anything unusual behind the great tapestry in the hall?" Stevens did not blink. "Dust and woodworm, sir. Nothing more." Yet something in the man's tone made Poirot's moustaches bristle anew. From the window of the blue suite, he could see the park falling away into mist. the trees black against a sky the colour of tarnished pewter. Somewhere far below, a clock struck the quarter hour with a note of hollow melancholy. Hercule Poirot smoothed his moustaches, turned from the window, and addressed his reflection in the looking-glass with quiet satisfaction. "Eh bien," he murmured, "we have a house full of secrets, a tapestry older than the sins it no doubt conceals, and a host who is afraid. The game, I think, has already begun." He did not yet know how soon the first player would be removed from the board. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Shadows. Dinner at Blackwood Manor was announced by a gong that sounded less like a summons than a funeral knell. Hercule Poirot descended the great staircase with the measured tread of a man who knows that every eye will turn toward him and wishes to give them something worth seeing. His evening clothes were impeccable, the white waistcoat gleaming, the patent shoes reflecting the candlelight like black mirrors. At his throat, the pearl pin winked with discreet arrogance. The dining room was so long, oak-panelled, and lit chiefly by a chandelier so ancient that the candles trembled in perpetual dread of falling. Portraits of long-dead Hargroves glared down at the table, as though disapproving of everything that had happened since the Reformation. The great tapestry was visible through the open double doors at the far end of the hall, its crimson huntsman seeming to gallop in the shifting firelight. Lord Reginald sat at the head, upright as a guardsman, carving a saddle of mutton with short, vicious strokes. To his right, Mrs. Lavinia Trevelyan sparkled in emerald silk and diamonds that were almost certainly real. To his left, Elena Voss wore black again, severe and dramatic, her only ornament the amber beads that caught the light like drops of frozen fire. Poirot was placed between Colonel Bantry and Dr. Moreau. Victor Hargrove lounged opposite, already on his second glass of claret, cheeks flushed. Conversation began politely enough. The pheasant season, the unreliability of London servants, but Poirot felt the tension coiled beneath every commonplace phrase. Victor raised his glass to his uncle with exaggerated courtesy. "To your health, sir. May it long continue." The words were pleasant, the tone was not. Lord Reginald's knife paused for a fraction of a second before resuming its work. Mrs. Trevelyan gave her bright metallic laugh. "Really, Victor, one would think you were impatient for your inheritance." "Only impatient for another bottle of this excellent claret," Victor replied. But his eyes flicked toward the old man with something that was not quite amusement. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat noisily. "Damned impertinence," he muttered into his soup. "In my day, a nephew knew his place." "And in your day, Colonel," Elena Voss said quietly, "people still settled matters with pistols at dawn. How much more civilized we have become." The Colonel flushed brick red and reached for the decanter. Poirot sipped his consommé and observed. He observed the way Lord Reginald's left hand, hidden beneath the table, clenched and unclenched. He observed that Dr. Moreau had scarcely touched his food, his gaze darting continually towards the hall. He observed that when Stevens the butler leaned to serve Mrs. Trevelyan, she flinched as though the man's shadow had burned her. After the fish course, Lord Reginald laid down his fork with sudden decision. "Monsieur Poirot," he said loudly, "my guests are no doubt wondering why I have imported a famous detective into their midst. I will satisfy their curiosity. There has been unpleasantness. Anonymous letters, threats, nothing I cannot deal with, but I prefer to have an independent witness should matters escalate." Victor gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Threats? Really, uncle, if someone dislikes you enough to write poison pen letters, perhaps you should examine your own behaviour." "Victor!" Mrs. Trevelyan's voice cracked like a whip. Apologize at once." He shrugged, unrepentant. "Why? It's true. Half the county knows you ruined old Carver over that land deal. Perhaps his son has finally— Enough!" Lord Reginald's fist struck the table. Glasses jumped. For a moment, the hawk mask slipped, and Poirot saw raw fear beneath the anger. Then the mask was back in place. "We will not spoil Monsieur Poirot's dinner with family squabbles." But the damage was done. The rest of the meal passed in brittle silences, broken by forced pleasantries. When the ladies withdrew, the port was circulated in near silence. Colonel Bantry drank steadily. Dr. Morrow twisted his napkin into knots. Victor stared at his uncle with open speculation. At last Lord Reginald pushed back his chair. "I have papers to attend to in the library. Victor, you will oblige me by remaining here with our guests. Monsieur Poirot, perhaps you would care to join me for a cigar?" Poirot inclined his head. "With pleasure." The library lay at the far end of the hall, beyond the great tapestry. As they passed it, Lord Reginald's step slowed almost imperceptibly. Poirot noticed that the lower corner of the weaving, the place where the stag's blood dripped onto moss, had been lifted recently. A few threads were caught on a projecting nail in the panelling. Inside the library, the air was thick with the scent of leather, cigar smoke, and old secrets. A coal fire hissed in the grate. Lord Reginald closed the door with care, then crossed to a decanter on the sideboard. "Brandy. Merci, non. My digestion, you understand." Lord Reginald poured himself a generous measure and drank half of it in one swallow. "You will think me an old fool," he said at last, "but I am being watched. In my own house. Someone moves things when I am not in a room. My papers are disarranged. Last week I found a sprig of yew on my pillow. You, Monsieur Poirot, the tree of graveyards." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And these anonymous letters?" Lord Reginald unlocked a drawer and produced 3 sheets of commonplace stationery. The messages were typed. "Your time is running out, the stag will fall. What was hidden will be revealed." Poirot turned the pages thoughtfully. "The paper is cheap, the machine an ordinary office corona. Posted in Shrewsbury. No fingerprints, I would imagine." "None. And you suspect—" Lord Reginald hesitated. "My nephew needs money desperately. There are debts, gambling, a woman in London. Lavinia Trevelyan would sell her soul, and has sold most of her jewellery, to be Lady Hargrove. Elena Voss paints my portrait but watches me as though measuring me for a coffin. Even Morrow. Did you know the British Museum offered me a fortune for the tapestry and I refused? He has not forgiven me." He drained the brandy. "I am not a coward, Monsieur Poirot, but I am 68 years old, and I have no desire to die before my time." Poirot tapped the letters together into a neat pile. "You wish me to discover who torments you?" "I wish you to prevent murder," Lord Reginald said harshly. "Because that is what this is leading to. I feel it." A sudden clamour in the hall interrupted them. Raised voices, the crash of something breaking. They hurried out to find Victor Hargrove swaying drunkenly before the great tapestry, a shattered whisky glass at his feet. "Look at it!" he shouted, gesturing wildly. "All that blood! Centuries of killing for sport! That's what this family is, Uncle. Killers. And you're the worst of them." Colonel Bantry was trying to pull him away. Mrs. Trevelyan stood white-faced in the doorway to the drawing-room. Elena Voss watched from the foot of the stairs, utterly still, as though posing her own portrait of contempt. Lord Reginald's voice cut like a blade. "Go to bed, Victor. You are drunk." "Drunk?" Victor laughed wildly. "I'm the only sober one here. I see everything. I know what's coming." Dr. Moreau appeared suddenly at Poirot's elbow, his face the colour of tallow. "Monsieur Poirot," he whispered, "there is something behind the tapestry. I swear it. I heard breathing." For a moment, the hall was utterly silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Then Lord Reginald strode forward and seized the heavy fabric in both hands. "Very well," he said grimly, "let us end this nonsense." He flung the tapestry aside. Nothing, only the bare stone wall, cold and slightly damp, and a scattering of dead moths on the floor. Victor gave a cracked laugh. "See? Nothing at all." But Poirot, standing a little to one side, saw what the others did not. A single fresh scratch in the panelling, no longer than a thumbnail, as though something sharp had recently been dragged across the oak. He said nothing. Lord Reginald let the tapestry fall back into place. The heavy weave settled with a soft sigh, like a curtain descending on the first act of a tragedy. Later, in the silence of his bedroom, Poirot sat before the fire in his violet silk dressing-gown and considered the evening. So many passions, so many fears, all swirling around an old piece of woven wool and the violent images it preserved. He took out his little notebook and wrote neatly, "Lord R. is genuinely frightened. Victor desires money and resents authority. Mrs. T desires position and perhaps revenge. Miss Voss hides strong emotion beneath coldness. Dr. Moreau knows something about the tapestry he has not revealed. Someone has recently moved or examined the wall behind the hanging." He closed the notebook, twirled his moustaches, and permitted himself the smallest of smiles. "Tomorrow," he murmured to the leaping flames, "the little grey cells begin their work in earnest." Somewhere in the black corridors of the manor, a door closed softly, and footsteps receded into silence. Chapter 3. The Body Unveiled. The scream that tore through Blackwood Manor at 23 minutes past 2 in the morning was not the polite, restrained cry of an English gentlewoman startled by a mouse. It was raw, animal, the sound a throat makes when the mind has already understood what the eyes refuse to accept. Hercule Poirot was awake instantly. Years of sleeping lightly, the legacy of too many nights when a knock on the door had meant danger, had trained his body better than any alarm clock. He was already in his dressing-gown of quilted burgundy silk, and slipping his feet into leather slippers before the second scream came, fainter, as though the screamer had run out of air. He opened his door. The corridor was a tunnel of darkness, lit only by the dull red eye of the dying fire at the far end. Another door opened. Colonel Bantry, in pyjamas and a military greatcoat, clutching an old Webley revolver that looked too heavy for his shaking hand. "What the devil?" the colonel began. A third door banged. Elena Voss appeared, black hair loose over a crimson wrapper, eyes enormous. Behind her, Dr. Moreau peered out like a frightened rabbit. From the main staircase came the sound of running feet. Stevens the butler, impossibly dignified even in a striped nightshirt, was ascending 2 steps at a time, carrying a candelabrum that shook violently in his grip. "It's his lordship, sir," he panted as he reached the landing. "Mrs. Trevelyan found him in the hall behind the tapestry." Poirot was already moving. They descended in a ragged procession. Poirot in the lead, Stevens with the candles, the colonel muttering curses, Elena Voss silent and swift as a shadow. Victor Hargrove appeared on the half-landing, hair tousled, eyes bloodshot, barefoot in evening trousers and a silk shirt open at the throat. "What's happened?" he demanded thickly. No one answered. They spilled into the great hall together. Lavinia Trevelyan stood in the centre of the floor as though rooted there, both hands pressed to her mouth. She wore a peach-coloured negligée and a sable wrap that had slipped from one shoulder. Her eyes were fixed on the tapestry. The lower corner had been pulled aside and pinned back with what looked like a lady's hatpin of garnets and gold. Behind the heavy weave, in the narrow space between fabric and wall, Lord Reginald Hargrove sat slumped like a broken marionette. His head had fallen forward. The iron-grey hair was disarranged for the first time in Poirot's acquaintance. His dinner jacket was immaculate, the white tie still perfectly knotted, but his face, what could be seen of it, was a dreadful plum colour, the tongue protruding slightly, the eyes bulging in a fixed stare of astonishment. One gloved hand, he still wore his white evening gloves, rested on his thigh. The other was stretched upward, fingers curled as though he had been clawing at the stone wall when strength failed. A single candle on the mantelpiece guttered, throwing the scene into lurid motion. The crimson huntsman on the tapestry seemed to gallop across the dead man's shoulder. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Victor gave a strange, choking laugh. "Well," he said, voice cracking, "the old man always did like to hide his treasures." Colonel Bantry rounded on him with a roar. "Have you no decency, boy?" Victor's face crumpled. He turned away abruptly and was quietly sick in a suit of armour. Poirot stepped forward, motioning the others back. He knelt, careful of the creases in his dressing gown, and studied the body without touching it. The smell reached him then. Bitter almonds, faint but unmistakable beneath the heavier odours of candle smoke and old wool. "Prussic acid," he murmured, "hydrocyanic acid to be precise. Very swift." He looked up at Stevens. "When did you last see his lordship alive?" "Shortly after midnight, sir. He came down for a book, he said. I offered to fetch it, but he insisted on choosing it himself. I left him here, reading by the fire. And the tapestry, was it disturbed then?" Stevens hesitated. "I cannot say, sir. I did not notice." Poirot's gaze moved to Mrs. Trevelyan. She had lowered her hands. They were trembling violently. "Madame, you discovered him." She nodded, unable to speak. Tears had made black rivulets of her mascara. "I couldn't sleep," she managed at last. "I came down for a book, something light. The fire was still burning low. I saw the corner of the tapestry caught back, just as it is now. I thought one of the maids had been careless. I went to put it right and—" Her voice broke. "His shoe! I saw his shoe first. Black patent, sticking out." Poirot rose. "And the hat-pin that holds the tapestry?" Mrs. Trevelyan touched her dishevelled hair with automatic fingers. "It's mine. I wore it yesterday in my travelling hat. I must have left it on the console table." Victor had recovered enough to sneer. "How very convenient!" Elena Voss spoke for the first time, her voice low and icy. "Nothing about this is convenient, Mr. Hargrove." Poirot turned to the body again. Carefully, he lifted the dead man's right hand. Beneath the glove, the wrist bore the faint imprint of a watch that had been removed post-mortem. The skin was pale where the strap had been. He examined the wall behind the corpse. The fresh scratch he had noticed earlier had been joined by several more, deeper, frantic. One fingernail, Lord Reginald's left index, was torn to the quick and dark, with dried blood. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He reached into his pocket for a small electric torch and played its beam along the panelling. At waist height, he found what he sought. A tiny hole, no larger than a sixpence, bored clean through the oak. The edges were fresh, the wood pale. He straightened. "Stevens, telephone the police at once. Tell them Lord Hargrove has been poisoned. and ask that Inspector Leach of the County Constabulary attend personally. I have worked with him before. No one is to leave the house." Stevens bowed and departed with remarkable composure. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Look here, Poirot. Are you certain it's murder? The old boy had a dicky heart. Could have been natural. Natural causes do not administer prussic acid, mon colonel. Nor do they remove a gentleman's wristwatch after death. No, this is murder, cunningly contrived." Victor Hargrove laughed again. A high, unpleasant sound. "Well then, Uncle got his wish after all. He wanted you here to prevent murder, Monsieur Poirot. You arrived on Friday. He died on Saturday night. Hardly a triumph for the famous little grey cells, is it?" Poirot regarded him steadily. "On the contrary, Monsieur Hargrove, the game has only just begun. And now the board is set exactly as the murderer intended." He turned to the others. "Mesdames, Messieurs, I must ask you all to return to your rooms. Lock your doors. Touch nothing in the hall. Dr. Morrow," he fixed the archaeologist with a sudden sharp glance, "you will oblige me by remaining here a moment." The others filed away. Mrs. Trevelyan supported by Elena Voss, the colonel muttering furiously. Victor cast one last look at his uncle's body and followed, shoulders hunched. When only Poirot and Morrow remained, the little detective spoke softly. "You told me last night, Docteur, that you heard breathing behind the tapestry." Morrow's face was the colour of old parchment. I thought I did. It was late. I'd been working in the library. Perhaps I imagined—" "No." Poirot's voice was gentle but implacable. "You heard Lord Reginald dying, non? Slowly suffocating as the poison took hold. The hole in the panelling, someone watched him through it. Someone stood on this side of the tapestry and observed the agony." Morrow put a hand to his mouth. "Mon Dieu!" "Precisely," said Poirot, "and that someone, mon ami, was in this hall long enough to pin back the tapestry with a hat-pin, to remove a watch, and to arrange the scene exactly so." He looked once more at the dead man, at the bulging eyes that stared eternally at the woven hounds tearing the stag apart. "Lord Reginald Hargrove believed himself the hunter," Poirot murmured. "In the end, he became the quarry." From the grandfather clock in the corner came the first chime of 3 o'clock, slow and mournful, as though the house itself mourned its master. Somewhere upstairs a door slammed. Footsteps crossed a bedroom floor and stopped. In the flickering candlelight, the great tapestry seemed almost to breathe. Chapter 4. Threads of Deception. By the time the first pale light of a November dawn crept through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, the hall had become a stage for officialdom. 2 constables in heavy greatcoats stood like sentries beside the tapestry. A photographer's magnesium flashes lit the crimson huntsman in ghastly white bursts. Dr. Spencer, the police surgeon, knelt beside the body and muttered Latin phrases under his breath. Inspector Leach, tall, lantern-jawed, and quietly courteous, greeted Poirot with the relief of a man who has worked with him before and knows exactly how irritatingly helpful the Belgian can be. "Morning, Monsieur Poirot. I'm told you were a guest. Convenient, that." "Convenient for the murderer, perhaps," Poirot replied dryly. "For me, less so. I was engaged to prevent a crime, and instead I arrive in time to admire its execution. Come, let us examine what we have." They stood together before the tapestry, now held back by a length of police string. Lord Reginald's body had been removed to the billiard-room for the post-mortem, but the chalk outline of his shoes remained, absurdly small against the vast weave. Leach pointed to the tiny hole in the panelling. "Spy hole. Clever. Whoever bored it could stand in the recess behind that suit of armour, watch his lordship die and never be seen. More than watch, Poirot corrected. Listen, the breathing Dr. Moreau heard was the victim's last struggle. And observe, he indicated the garnet hatpin now lying in an evidence envelope. The tapestry was pinned back after death, so the body would be discovered quickly. Our murderer is vain. He wishes his tableau to be appreciated. Leach grunted. Motive? Several on offer. Greed, revenge, fear. Perhaps all three braided together like the threads of this hanging. Poirot ran a manicured finger along the lower border of the tapestry. But first we must understand the stage itself. This piece is more than decoration. It is the heart of the drama. He turned to Dr. Felix Moreau, who hovered nearby wrapped in a vast ulster coat, looking as though he had not slept. Doctor, you have studied this tapestry for months. Tell Inspector Leach what you told me privately yesterday. Moreau swallowed. There is a family legend. The Blackwoods were never merely landowners. In the 15th century, Sir Giles de Blackwood, the knight depicted as the central huntsman, was guardian of a relic smuggled out of Constantinople after the sack of 1204. A fragment of the true cross, mounted in gold and rubies, worth a king's ransom even then. Leach raised an eyebrow, and Sir Giles grew afraid the relic would be stolen. Before riding to Agincourt, he ordered it hidden. The tapestry was woven in Arras to his exact instructions. Certain symbols, a tiny cross in the stag's eye, a ruby-red flower that appears nowhere else in medieval weaving, mark the spot where the relic was sewn into the lining. Over the centuries, the knowledge was lost or deliberately suppressed. The Blackwoods preferred land and coal mines to holy relics. Poirot nodded, but recently Lord Reginald decided to sell the tapestry to an American collector for £200,000. You, Dr. Moreau, protested on behalf of the nation. His lordship refused every plea. Then, 3 weeks ago, he suddenly changed his mind. He cancelled the sale. Moreau's voice dropped. He told me he had found something sewn into the backing. He would say no more, only that the American would never have it. Leach whistled softly. So the old man discovered the relic after all, and someone killed him for it. Or to prevent him revealing it, Poirot said, or to punish him for centuries of family greed. We have motives as plentiful as blackberries. They were interrupted by Stevens, who approached with a silver salver, on which lay a small object wrapped in a linen handkerchief. Begging your pardon, sir. This was found by the housemaid in the waste-paper basket of the blue bedroom, Miss Voss's room. I thought it best to bring it straight to you. Poirot unfolded the handkerchief. Inside lay a minute brown glass bottle, empty, bearing the faded label of a London chemist and the single word cyanide. Leach's eyes narrowed. Well, well, looks like the lady artist has some explaining to do. Poirot's expression did not change, but his voice sharpened. Have the bottle examined for prints at once, and send for Miss Voss. Politely, if you please. While they waited, Poirot led Leach to the library. On the desk lay Lord Reginald's appointments diary, open at the previous week. One entry, heavily inked, read VH, final warning, settlement, or exposure. No more credit. Beneath it, in a different hand, spidery hurried, someone had scrawled, The stag will fall. Leach tapped the page. VH is the nephew, I take it? Undoubtedly. Victor Hargrove is drowning in debt. His uncle was threatening to cut him off entirely. Exposure would have meant scandal, perhaps prison. The door opened. Elena Voss entered, pale but composed, dressed in a charcoal skirt and white blouse, the amber beads at her throat the only note of colour. You wish to see me, Inspector? Leach held up the brown bottle in its glassine envelope. "This was found in your room, Miss Voss. Care to explain?" She looked at it without flinching. "It is mine, or was. I use potassium cyanide in small quantities for fixing certain pigments, vermilion particularly. Artists have done so for centuries. The bottle has been missing since yesterday afternoon. I assumed I had mislaid it." "Convenient," Leach said. "Or true," she replied coolly. "You will find my fingerprints on it, I have no doubt, but no one else's, because I always handle it with gloves." Poirot regarded her steadily. "Mademoiselle, last night you were heard to say to Lord Reginald, 'Some things should remain buried.' What did you mean?" Her chin lifted. "Exactly what I said. He was about to rip that tapestry from its rail and gut it like a fish in search of his wretched relic. A masterpiece would have been destroyed for the sake of a medieval trinket. I told him he would regret it. And this morning, Poirot continued softly, he is dead, hidden behind the very hanging you intended to destroy." For the first time her composure wavered. "I did not kill him." "Yet someone used your poison," Leach said. "Someone who wished to cast suspicion on me," she answered. "Someone who knew where I kept my materials." Poirot dismissed her with a courteous nod. When the door closed, he turned to Leach. "Observe the psychology. The bottle is left in her room to incriminate her. Yet the method, prussic acid poured no doubt into his lordship's postprandial brandy, required access to the decanter in the library. Miss Voss was never alone there after dinner. Non, this is misdirection." He crossed to the fireplace and stared into the dead ashes. "Consider the timing. Lord Reginald came down after midnight for a book. Stephen saw him pour a nightcap. The murderer must have followed almost immediately, doctored the brandy, then lured or forced his lordship to the tapestry, perhaps with a note, perhaps with a whispered threat. There the victim was made to stand while the poison took effect. The spy hole allowed the killer to watch until death was certain. Then the small touches. The watch removed, why? The tapestry pinned back with Mrs. Trevelyan's hatpin, another false trail. The body arranged to mimic the dying stag. Leach rubbed his chin. "The watch bothers me. Solid gold, worth a few hundred. Not robbery. The signet ring and wallet were untouched." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. The watch was removed for a reason. To conceal something, perhaps? Or to provide something? We shall see." From the hall came the sound of raised voices. Victor Hargrove, flushed and furious, was arguing with a constable. "I have a right to see my uncle's will. I'm the heir." Leach exchanged a glance with Poirot and smiled without humour. "Round up the household, Monsieur Poirot. I think it's time we all had a little talk in the drawing-room." As they walked back toward the hall, Poirot paused once more before the great tapestry. In the cold morning light, the woven blood looked almost black. He traced with one finger the tiny cross hidden in the stag's eye, so small that only someone who knew it was there would ever notice. "Somewhere in this house," he murmured, "is a fragment of wood and gold that men have killed for across 6 centuries. And now another man has died because of it. But I tell you, mon ami, the relic is not the only thing that has been hidden behind this tapestry." He let the heavy fabric fall back into place. "Somewhere behind these threads lies the truth, and Hercule Poirot will unravel it, stitch by stitch." Chapter 5. The Artist's Secret Palette. The drawing-room at Blackwood Manor had never felt smaller. 10 people sat in a rough circle beneath the stern gaze of ancestral portraits. 6 guests, Stevens the butler, the housekeeper Mrs. Denning, and Inspector Leach, flanked by a stolid sergeant, who wrote everything down in laborious copperplate. A coal fire crackled with spiteful energy, yet the room remained cold. Poirot stood before the marble mantelpiece, hands clasped behind his back, green eyes moving from face to face like a tailor taking measurements. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began quietly, "we are all suspects in the eyes of the law. Some of you more than others, naturellement. But Hercule Poirot prefers truth to suspicion. Therefore, I propose a little experiment in honesty. Each of you will tell me exactly where you were between midnight and 2:30 this morning. Lies will be noted. The truth may save an innocent life, perhaps your own." A nervous rustle passed around the circle. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat like a man about to charge a machine-gun nest. "I was in my room, reading Kipling, dropped off around 1, heard nothing until the screaming." Victor Hargrove gave a brittle laugh. "I was drunk, passed out on my bed fully dressed. Ask Stevens. He helped me up the stairs at 12:30. Stevens inclined his head in confirmation. Mrs. Trevelyan dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief that had already done heavy service. "I took a sleeping powder at 11. I woke only when I came down for a book and found poor Reginald." Her voice trembled theatrically. Dr. Moreau twisted his signet ring round and round. "I worked in the library until nearly 2. I heard, as I told Monsieur Poirot, a kind of muffled gasping behind the tapestry. I thought I was imagining things. I went up to bed immediately after." Elena Voss was last. She sat very straight, hands folded in her lap, black hair drawn severely back. "I was in my room painting. I often work at night. The light from the fire is kinder than electricity. I heard nothing until Mrs. Trevelyan screamed." Poirot's gaze rested on her for a long moment. "Painting, mademoiselle. At 2 in the morning. May we see the canvas?" A faint flush rose in her cheeks. The first crack in the ice. "It is not finished, and it is private." "Nevertheless," Inspector Leach said heavily, "we shall have to see it, miss." Elena rose with icy dignity. "Very well. Follow me." They trooped upstairs in silence. Poirot, Leach, Victor, who seemed unable to stay away from any drama, and 2 constables. Elena's bedroom smelled faintly of turpentine and tuberose. An easel stood before the fire. On it rested a canvas covered by a paint-stained cloth. She hesitated, then pulled the cloth away. The portrait was unmistakable. Lord Reginald Hargrove, seated in the library, one hand resting on the appointments diary, the other holding a crystal brandy glass. The likeness was merciless. Every line of arrogance, every shadow of fear had been caught and fixed in oils. But what froze every onlooker was the background. Behind the figure, sketched in charcoal with almost photographic precision, was the great tapestry. Every hound, every huntsman, the dying stag. And in the stag's eye, the tiny cross had been outlined in actual gold leaf, glittering malevolently. Victor gave a low whistle. "My God, Elena, you hateful little—" "Silence!" Poirot snapped. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Observe, Inspector. The paint is still wet in places, but look here." He indicated the brandy glass in the painted hand. A faint bluish tint shimmered at the bottom of the crystal. "Prussian blue mixed with viridian," Elena said quickly. "An experiment in shadow tones." "Or an experiment in suggesting poison," Poirot murmured. Leach turned to her. "Did his lordship sit for this portrait?" "3 times. The last sitting was the afternoon before he died. He was agitated. He kept looking over his shoulder at the door." Victor laughed unpleasantly, probably wondering which of us was going to murder him. Poirot ignored him. He was studying a small rosewood box on the dressing table, Elena's paint box. The lid stood open. Inside, among tubes of pigment and folded rags, lay a folded square of heavy vellum. With a murmured apology, he lifted it out. It was a tracing, delicate, exact, of the lower left corner of the tapestry. Certain threads had been numbered in red ink. At the bottom, in Elena's angular handwriting, were the words "Third hound from left, 7th warp thread from selvage. Pull gently." Poirot held it up. "You have been doing more than painting, mademoiselle." Elena's composure finally shattered. "I was trying to save the tapestry. Reginald intended to cut it down that very night. He told me so after dinner, that he had found the relic and would have it out before morning, American buyer or no. I begged him to wait, to let experts examine it non-destructively. He laughed at me, said sentiment was for paupers." Her voice shook with fury. "So yes, I came down after midnight. I thought if I could locate the exact spot and remove only the few stitches necessary, I could extract the relic myself and prove the tapestry need not be destroyed. I traced the section by candlelight, but when I reached the hall, she stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Go on," Leach said grimly. "The library door was ajar. The decanter and glass were on the desk. I saw Lord Hargrove standing by the tapestry swaying. He turned toward me, his face already turning purple. He tried to speak, but only a dreadful bubbling sound came out. Then he toppled sideways, and the tapestry fell across him like a shroud. I panicked. I fled upstairs." Victor sneered. "Very convenient. You poisoned him, then ran away." "I did not." Her eyes blazed. "Someone else was there. I smelled a man's tobacco. Turkish, heavy, not Reginald's brand." Poirot's head snapped round. "You are certain?" "Absolutely. I have a nose for tobacco. My father smoked a pipe." Colonel Bantry shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. Poirot's gaze flicked to him. The colonel's pockets always bulged with a battered tin of Balkan Sobrani. But he said nothing yet. Leach was making notes. "So you admit being in the hall at the crucial time, handling the tapestry, and possessing both cyanide and motive?" "I admit trying to save a priceless artifact," Elena said fiercely. "I deny murder." Poirot replaced the tracing in the paint box and closed the lid with a soft click. "One moment, Inspector. Observe the palette beside the easel." A wooden palette lay there, crusted with dried colour. In one corner, a blob of fresh paint, viridian and white, had been squeezed out and then scored deeply by a palette knife, as though in sudden rage. "And the knife itself?" Poirot asked. Elena opened a drawer and produced it. The blade was clean, but a few strands of crimson wool, exact match for the tapestry's blood threads, were caught in the join of blade and handle. "I used it to scrape paint," she said defiantly. "Nothing more." Poirot turned to Leach. "Mademoiselle Voss has given us several valuable gifts. A witness who smelled Turkish tobacco, a suggestion that the brandy was doctored in the library before the victim moved to the hall, and confirmation that the murderer was present at the very moment of death, yet chose not to summon help. All most illuminating." He bowed slightly to Elena. "You may cover your canvas again, mademoiselle, for now." As they descended the stairs, Victor lingered behind with Poirot. "You believe her?" he asked incredulously. "I believe," Poirot said, "that everyone in this house is lying about something. Mademoiselle Voss perhaps lies least of all, but even a small lie can be the loose thread that unravels the entire weave." In the hall, the police photographer was packing away his equipment. Sunlight, thin and cold, now struck full across the tapestry. For the first time, Poirot noticed something he had missed before. One of the woven hounds, the third from the left in the lower border, had a tiny rent in its flank, no longer than a fingernail. The warp threads beneath were disturbed, as though something had very recently been pulled through them. He stood motionless, staring at the damage. "Mon Dieu!" he whispered. "The relic! It has already been taken." Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 11, each chime falling like a hammer on cold iron. Chapter 6. Echoes from the Past. The storm arrived at Blackwood Manor shortly after luncheon. As though the sky itself had been waiting for permission to mourn, black clouds rolled in from the Welsh hills, wind screamed in the chimneys, and rain lashed the windows like thrown gravel. The police had finished their preliminary work and withdrawn to the kitchen for tea and gossip with the servants. The great house felt suddenly cavernous, every corridor echoing, every footstep sounding like pursuit. Poirot had asked that no one leave the premises. He had also, with Leech's reluctant permission, taken possession of the library. The door was locked, the fire rebuilt, and upon the vast mahogany desk lay the accumulated evidence: the brown cyanide bottle, the garnet hatpin, Lord Reginald's appointments diary, Elena Voss's tracing, and the small vellum envelope that had contained the missing watch. Poirot sat very still, hands folded, staring at the tapestry visible through the open double doors. The torn thread in the hound's flank gnawed at him. Someone had removed the relic in the last 48 hours, probably in the very hour of the murder, and had done it with such delicacy that only the closest inspection revealed the damage. He rose at last, crossed the hall, and stood before the hanging. With infinite care, he lifted the lower border and let his fingers travel along the reverse side. The lining was coarse linen, darkened by centuries of soot and candle smoke. At the place corresponding to the wounded hound, he felt it, a slit no longer than 2 inches, edges turned under and stitched with modern black cotton, work done in haste, but by a skilful hand. The relic was gone. Poirot let the tapestry fall and returned to the library. He rang the bell. When Stevens appeared, the butler's face was grey with fatigue. "Stevens, you have served this family for how long?" 39 years come Michaelmas, sir." "Then you will know where the late Lord Reginald kept his private papers." Stevens hesitated only a fraction. "The muniments room, sir, above the old chapel. His lordship spent much time there of late. Conduct me." They ascended a narrow stair hidden behind a tapestry on the first landing. Another weaving, smaller, depicting the flaying of Marsyas. Poirot reflected that the Blackwoods had peculiar taste in decoration. The muniments room was a long, cold chamber, lined with iron-bound deed boxes and shelves of ledgers bound in crumbling vellum. Rain drummed on the leaded roof like impatient fingers. On a central table lay disorder, papers strewn, drawers pulled open. A green-shaded reading lamp still burned. In the hearth lay the ashes of many documents, some only half consumed. Poirot knelt, careless of his trousers, and with a pair of tongs extracted a fragment that had escaped the flames. It was part of a letter, the handwriting spidery and old. "Therefore, I charge my heirs that the cross of Constantinople shall remain hidden until such time as England hath need of it again. Let no man disturb the weave on pain of God's curse and the vengeance of the Blackwoods." The fragment ended in charred ruin. Poirot's eyes gleamed. So, the 16th century Sir Fulk Blackwood feared the Reformation would destroy the relic and commanded it hidden forever. Yet his descendants have ever been tempted. He turned to the table. Among the chaos lay a small leather-bound diary for 1917, its pages warped by damp. Poirot opened it with care. The entries were in a younger lord, Reginald's hand. He had been a captain in the Shropshire Yeomanry. One page, dated 11th November 1918, was heavily underlined. Carver killed this morning. Shell burst directly on the dugout. Poor devil never knew. He had the relic in his pocket, the little gold cross we found in the ruins of that church near Arras. I took it from his body, promised him once I'd bring it home. God forgive me, I cannot now remember why we quarrelled. Only that we did, bitterly. If I live, I swear I'll make amends to his boy. Poirot closed the diary softly. Stevens, who is Carver? The butler's face became utterly expressionless. Mr. Edward Carver, sir. His lordship's subaltern. Killed on the Somme. His lordship bought the Carver estate after the war when the bank foreclosed. The family said it was kindly meant, a home for the widow. Others said less kindly. And the son? Mr. James Carver, sir. Lives quietly in the village, odd jobs. Some say he drinks. Poirot nodded slowly. Bring me Mrs. Denning, the housekeeper. Then find Colonel Bantry and ask him to join us here. Mrs. Denning arrived flustered, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been housekeeper for 25 years and remembered everything. Yes, sir. Young Mr. James used to come to the kitchen when he was a lad. His lordship was always generous. Christmas boxes, a pony once. Then, when Mr. James was 16, there was a terrible row. His lordship accused him of stealing from the gun-room. Turned him off the estate. After that, the anonymous letters began. Poisonous things about war profiteering, about Captain Carver's death. His lordship said they were from James. And were they? Mrs. Denning looked uncomfortable. I couldn't say, sir, but the letters stopped when Mr. James went for a soldier in 39. Came back with only one arm. Never wrote again. Not that I know. Colonel Bantry arrived smelling strongly of whisky and wet tweed. What's all this, Poirot? Damned nearly blew me into the rose garden coming across the courtyard. Poirot held up the 1917 diary. Colonel, you served in France. You knew Lord Reginald then? Bantry's eyes flickered. Served with him, yes. Fine officer. Bit stiff, but steady under fire. And Lieutenant Carver? The colonel's face hardened. Poor chap. Bought it the day before the armistice. Bad luck. Or worse, Poirot said softly. You were there when the relic was found. Silence stretched. Rain hammered the roof. I was, Bantry said at last. Reggie and I dug it out of a bombed church. Little gold cross, Byzantine work. Reggie was queer about it. Said it had kept him alive through 4 years of hell. Carver laughed, said it was fairy tales. They quarrelled like cat and dog over it. Then the shell came. He stared at his trembling hands. Reggie took the cross off Carver's body. Never spoke of it again, until last month. Started muttering about making restitution. Said he'd hidden it in the tapestry when he came home, like the old legend said. Wanted to give it back to James Carver. Madness, of course. Madness to you, Poirot said. Justice to him, perhaps. He turned to Stevens. One more task. Have Dr. Morrow sent to me, and ask Miss Voss if she will be so good as to bring her sketching materials. 10 minutes later, Morrow arrived nervous, spectacles fogged from the rain. Elena followed, carrying a portfolio. Poirot did not waste time. Docteur, you believe the relic to be national heritage. Mademoiselle, you wish to preserve the tapestry intact. Yet both of you knew Lord Reginald intended to remove the cross himself that very night. One of you, or both, came to this room after midnight. Morrow went white. I swear, Poirot raised a hand. I do not accuse, I reconstruct. Someone entered the library, found his lordship already drinking the poisoned brandy, perhaps poured by another hand entirely. That someone persuaded him to come to the hall, to show where the relic was hidden. While he stood there, dying, the murderer cut it free. Only a few stitches, the work of seconds with a sharp knife. Then the tapestry was allowed to fall across the body, concealing both crime and theft. Elena's eyes widened, but the slit was on the back. How could anyone reach it from the front? Exactly, Poirot said, which means the tapestry was lifted twice that night. Once by the murderer to extract the relic, once again later to arrange the body and pin it back with the hat pin. He opened Elena's portfolio and drew out a fresh sheet of heavy paper. Mademoiselle, you have the steadiest hand among us. I wish you to make a rapid sketch of the lower left corner of the tapestry exactly as it is now, every torn thread, every disturbance. Then we shall compare it with your earlier tracing. While she worked, Poirot moved to the window and stared out at the storm-lashed park. Somewhere out there, he thought, walked a man with one arm who had waited 30 years for justice or revenge. Behind him, the fire settled with a sigh. The house seemed to listen. When Elena finished, Poirot compared the two drawings. The difference was minute but unmistakable. In the new sketch, 3 additional warp threads had been pulled loose, threads that had been intact when Elena traced the section hours before the murder. He tapped the paper thoughtfully. So, the relic was taken after Lord Reginald was already dead or dying. The murderer stood in this very room, watching through the spy hole, knife in hand, and when the moment came, lifted the tapestry just enough to cut the pocket free. A crime of opportunity added to a crime of deliberation. Colonel Bantry made a choking sound. "My God! The watch!" Poirot turned swiftly. "Yes, mon colonel, the watch, removed after death. Why?" Bantry's voice was hoarse. Reggie always wore it in France, engraved on the back, carvers, initials, E.C. He had it done after the armistice. Guilt, I suppose. If the killer took the watch as well as the cross, then the murderer is James Carver, Moreau finished, horrified. Or someone who wishes us to think so, Poirot said quietly. Thunder crashed overhead. For an instant, the lightning illuminated the park. A solitary figure in a streaming oilskin coat could be seen at the edge of the trees, staring up at the house. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Or someone," he murmured, "who has just returned to the scene of his triumph, or his torment." He turned from the window. "Come, the past has spoken. Now it is time to listen to the present." Chapter 7. The Heir's Gambit. The storm broke at 4 o'clock, as suddenly as it had arrived. Rain ceased, wind dropped. A bruised, unnatural silence fell over Blackwood Manor. In that stillness, the house seemed to hold its breath. Inspector Leach had departed for Shrewsbury with the cyanide bottle, the hat-pin, and a sullen Victor Hargrove in the back of the police car. Not under arrest, Leach stressed, merely to assist with inquiries about certain gambling debts and a threatening letter found in his London flat. Victor had gone without protest, only a thin smile that might have been relief. Poirot had watched the car disappear down the drive, then turned back to the hall. The great tapestry hung motionless now, the wounded hound staring out with its single blind eye of gold thread. He summoned the remaining guests to the drawing-room. Colonel Bantry arrived smelling of whisky and wet dog. Dr. Moreau clutched a folder of notes as though it were a lifebelt. Elena Voss entered last, pale but composed, and took the chair farthest from the fire. Poirot did not sit. He stood with his back to the hearth, hands clasped behind him, the very picture of a small, neat accuser. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, "we have reached the moment where the cards must be placed upon the table. Some of you have played honestly. Others have bluffed. One of you has attempted to sweep the entire pot with a hand that is, how shall I put it, dramatically overbid. He let the silence stretch until Colonel Bantry coughed uncomfortably. First, the relic. It is gone. Removed by someone who knew exactly where to cut. Someone who had either studied Miss Voss's tracing or who possessed older knowledge. Second, the murder weapon. Prussic acid from Miss Voss's studio, yet administered in the library brandy before the victim ever reached the hall. Third, the watch. Taken from the wrist of a dead man for a reason we now understand. He paused, eyes moving across their faces. Fourth, he said softly, the performance. Colonel Bantry frowned. Performance? Precisely. This crime has been staged like a play in 3 acts. Act 1, the anonymous letters and the atmosphere of dread, to summon Hercule Poirot. Act 2, the murder behind the tapestry, complete with spy hole, hatpin, and dramatic tableau of the dying stag. Act 3, the scattering of false clues, cyanide in an artist's room, a torn thread to suggest the relic was taken by a greedy outsider. All most artistic. All designed to confuse, to overwhelm, to convince us that the motive was either greed or ancient vengeance. Elena Voss leaned forward. You are saying the motive was neither. I am saying the motive was simpler, more modern, and far more cruel. It was to inherit. Dr. Morrow gave a small, incredulous laugh. But Victor is the heir, and he is already— Victor, Poirot interrupted gently, is the heir presumptive, only presumptive. Because 6 weeks ago, Lord Reginald instructed his London solicitors to draw up a new will. A will that disinherited Victor entirely and left the bulk of the estate, including this house and the coal-bearing lands, to a charitable trust for ex-servicemen. Victor discovered this 10 days ago. Colonel Bantry went very still. Poirot continued. Victor needed money urgently. Creditors in London were no longer patient. One in particular, a man named Rocco, had begun sending gentlemen of muscular disposition to wait outside Victor's club. Murder became the only solution. But it must appear that Victor had nothing to gain, hence the elaborate spectacle of relic theft and old family curses. If suspicion fell upon a penniless artist, a guilt-ridden archaeologist, a one-armed village madman, or even a former brother officer haunted by the war, so much the better. He turned to Colonel Bantry. You, mon colonel, were intended to be the perfect scapegoat. The Turkish tobacco Miss Voss smelled, your distinctive mixture. The war diary left conveniently in the muniments room, the tremor in your hand that everyone has noticed. Even the watch, engraved with Edward Carver's initials, was to be planted among your possessions this afternoon. A tragic murder-suicide would have been the coroner's tidy verdict. Old soldier, tormented by guilt, finally destroys his former comrade and then himself. But the storm delayed the search of your room, and Victor was taken to Shrewsbury before the final act could be played. Bantry's face had gone the colour of old ash. My God, he whispered, the boy came to me yesterday, said he feared I might do something desperate, begged me to let him keep my service revolver, for safety. I thought he was being decent. Decent, Poirot repeated with soft irony. Yes, Victor has always been excellent at decent appearances. Elena Voss rose slowly. Then the relic? Was it taken at all? Oh, yes. Victor removed it himself, with Miss Voss's tracing as guide, while his uncle lay dying, but not for profit. The relic will be found, I fancy, hidden in the lining of Victor's motoring coat, ready to be discovered by the police, and used as further proof of how many people wished Lord Reginald dead. A final flourish. Dr. Morrow found his voice, but the new will, if Victor is disinherited, who benefits now? Poirot allowed himself a small, sad smile. That is the one detail Victor overlooked. In English law, if a testator is murdered before a new will is signed, the previous will stands. Victor remains the heir after all. The murder, you see, has achieved exactly what it intended, and Victor will walk free protesting his innocence, while the police chase ghosts from 1918. Colonel Bantry stood up abruptly, face working. "I'll wring the little bastard's neck myself." "Non, non, mon colonel," Poirot said quickly. "That pleasure belongs to the law, and to me." He crossed to the bell-pull and rang it twice, a signal prearranged with Leach. The door opened. Inspector Leach entered with 2 constables and, between them, a handcuffed Victor Hargrove. His handsome face was blotched with fury and fear. "You can't prove any of this," he shouted. "It's guesswork, Belgian guesswork." Poirot regarded him almost with pity. "On the contrary, mon ami. While you were admiring the Shrewsbury cells, the police searched your luggage. In the left pocket of your brown ulster, they found a small gold and ruby cross wrapped in cotton wool. On the back is engraved Ex Ossibus Sanctae Crucis, Constantinopolis 1204, and inside the cotton wool, most carelessly left, a single strand of crimson wool matching the tapestry exactly. Your fingerprints, I fear, are on the relic itself. You removed your gloves to feel the warmth of the gold, n'est-ce pas? A sentimental gesture. Fatal." Victor lunged forward. The constables restrained him without effort. "You meddling little—" Poirot cut him off with a gesture. "You arranged a superb performance, monsieur. Anonymous letters typed on a machine you borrowed from the estate office. The spy hole bored with a bradawl taken from the gun-room. The cyanide stolen from Miss Voss's box while she painted in the garden. The hatpin dropped deliberately near the console table. Even the yew leaves on your uncle's pillow, gathered from the churchyard to suggest a madman's curse. All most ingenious." He stepped closer, voice dropping to a whisper only Victor could hear. "But you forgot one thing. Hercule Poirot does not admire the stage machinery. He dismantles it." Victor's defiance collapsed. He sagged between the constables, suddenly a young man who had played for everything and lost. Leach snapped the handcuffs tighter. "Victor Hargrove, I arrest you for the murder of Reginald Arthur Blackwood Hargrove." As they led him away, his voice rose in a last desperate cry that echoed down the stone corridor. "It should have been mine! All of it! He had no right!" The door closed. Silence returned, heavier than before. Colonel Bantry sank into a chair and covered his face with his shaking hands. Elena Voss stared at the fire, amber beads rising and falling with her breath. Dr. Morrow simply looked dazed, as though waking from a long nightmare. Poirot permitted himself a small sigh. "And thus ends the heir's gambit," he said quietly. "A game played with poison and relics and 6 centuries of pride. In the end, all that remains is a small gold cross, stained, alas, with modern blood." Outside, the last of the storm clouds parted. A thin wintry sunlight touched the windows of Blackwood Manor for the first time in 2 days, striking crimson reflections from the tapestry in the hall, reflections that looked for one fleeting instant almost like fresh blood. Chapter 8. Unravelling the Weave. The drawing-room fire had burned low. Only 3 lamps were lit, throwing long shadows that made the ancestral portraits seem to lean forward, eager for the denouement. Outside, a hard frost had followed the storm. The windows were filmed with delicate ferns of ice. They were all assembled one final time. Colonel Bantry, rigid in an armchair, a large whisky untouched before him. Dr. Morrow perched on the edge of a sofa as though ready to bolt. Elena Voss standing by the window, black silhouette against the moonlit park. Inspector Leach and his sergeant by the door, Stevens the butler, statue still in the shadows. Victor Hargrove had been taken to Shrewsbury an hour earlier. Yet the air in the room still crackled with unfinished business. Poirot entered last. He had changed into a fresh suit of midnight blue and a waistcoat of dove grey. His shoes gleamed like black ice. He carried nothing in his hands, yet every eye followed him as though he bore the very sword of judgment. He did not speak at once. Instead, he crossed to the fireplace, warmed his hands for a moment, then turned. "Mesdames, monsieur," he began softly, "a little while ago I told you that Victor Hargrove murdered his uncle. That was true, as far as it went. But it was not the whole truth. A murder arranged with such elaborate care, such a profusion of false trails, does not spring from one mind alone. It requires a partner." A collective intake of breath. Colonel Bantry's glass rattled against his teeth. Poirot continued, voice gentle, inexorable. Victor supplied desperation and money-lust, but he did not possess the cool nerve, the intimate knowledge of the tapestry, the steady hand required to cut the relic free while a man died at his feet. Someone else stood behind the tapestry that night. Someone who bored the spy hole weeks ago, who stole the cyanide long before it was needed, who pinned the corner back with Mrs. Trevelyan's hatpin so that the body would be found exactly as planned. He turned toward Helena Voss. "Mademoiselle, you told us you fled upstairs when you saw Lord Reginald collapse. That was not true. You remained. You watched him die, and when he was dead, you performed the surgery upon the tapestry that you had rehearsed so many times in your mind." Helena did not move, but the amber beads at her throat trembled. "You loved the tapestry more than you ever loved any living soul," Poirot said. "When Lord Reginald threatened to rip it apart, you decided he must be stopped, permanently. Victor's panic over the new will gave you the perfect cat's paw. You would poison the brandy. Victor would lure his uncle to the hall on the pretext of showing him the relic's hiding place. And while Victor stood guard in the library, you would wait behind the tapestry. The death would look like Victor's crime. Greed, inheritance, the despairing nephew. Victor believed he was the murderer. You knew he was merely the bait." Dr. Morrow made a strangled sound. "But the Turkish tobacco was smoked by Colonel Bantry, yes, but deliberately left burning in an ashtray in the library by you, mademoiselle, to confuse the scent. The torn thread in the hound's flank, your work with your own palette knife, the tracing you left in your paint box, a deliberate gift to the police so that we would believe the artist acted alone and in passion." Elena's voice, when it came, was steady, almost wondering. "How long have you known?" "From the moment I saw the second sketch you made for me this afternoon. The 3 additional loose threads were not pulled by Victor. He had no need of subtlety once the relic was in his pocket. They were pulled by someone who wished us to believe the relic had been taken after death, not before. Someone creating a chronology that protected herself." She smiled then, a small, cold smile that belonged more to the woman who painted merciless portraits than to any living flesh. "Victor was a fool," she said. "He thought he manipulated me. I let him believe it. When he came to me 3 weeks ago, frantic about the new will, I offered him a perfect solution. I even typed the anonymous letters on the estate office machine, using gloves, of course. He thought they were to frighten his uncle into postponing the change of will. I knew they would bring you here, Monsieur Poirot, because only you would see through the fog to the real killer. And by then Victor would have hanged, and the tapestry would be safe forever." Colonel Bantry surged to his feet. "You cold-blooded—" "Sit down, Colonel," Leach said quietly. The sergeant had already moved to Elena's side. Poirot raised a hand. "One more thing, mademoiselle. The watch. You removed it yourself, did you not? To plant upon the colonel later?" She inclined her head. "It was in my pocket when I cut the relic free. I intended to drop it in the colonel's room tonight. A soldier deranged by guilt, an old story, easily believed." Leech produced handcuffs. Elena extended her wrists without being asked. The steel clicked shut with a small, final sound. As the sergeant led her toward the door, she paused beside Poirot. "Tell me one thing," she said softly. "If Victor had not been arrested so swiftly, would you have let him hang?" Poirot looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said at last. "Hercule Poirot does not permit even the guilty to pay for crimes they did not commit. But I would have let you watch him walk to the scaffold before I spoke. Justice has many faces, mademoiselle." For the first time something flickered behind her eyes, fear perhaps or regret. Then it was gone. At the door she turned back once more. "The tapestry will go to the nation now," she said, "unharmed. That at least I achieved." The door closed behind her. Colonel Bantry drained his whisky in one gulp. Dr. Moreau stared at the carpet as though seeing visions of prison bars. Stevens allowed himself the ghost of a sigh. Poirot walked to the window and looked out at the frost-silvered park. "Two murderers," he murmured. "One who killed for money, one who killed for art. And between them, an old man who tried too late to atone for a sin committed in the mud of Flanders." He was silent for a long time. Then, very softly, "Eh bien, the weave is unravelled. Now comes the harder task, to mend what has been torn." In the hall the great tapestry hung motionless, its colours muted by moonlight. The stag still bled, the hounds still bayed, the huntsman still rode. But the tiny cross in the stag's eye had been expertly rewoven that afternoon by a restorer from the Victoria and Albert, a favour to Poirot. No scar remained. Only the hound's flank still bore its small, deliberate wound, a reminder perhaps that some damage cannot be wholly repaired. Chapter 9. The Final Stitch. The morning was cold, bright, and merciless. Frost glittered on the lawns of Blackwood Manor like scattered diamonds. Every blade of grass stood sharp enough to cut. In the great hall, the police had finished their work. The chalk outline had been washed away, the spy-hole filled with oak dowel, the garnet hat-pin, and the little brown bottle sealed in evidence boxes bound for Shrewsbury Assizes. Only the tapestry remained, hanging as it had for 500 years, serene and terrible. Hercule Poirot stood before it alone. He had risen early, before the household stirred, and had asked Stevens to leave him undisturbed. Now he studied the weave with the concentration of a man reading the last page of a long and difficult book. Footsteps sounded behind him, soft but deliberate. He did not turn. "You have come to say goodbye to your friend, mademoiselle." Elena Voss had been released from the cells at dawn into the temporary custody of 2 police matrons. She wore a plain dark coat and no jewellery. Her hands were cuffed in front of her. Yet she carried herself with the same icy composure that had marked her from the first. "They allowed me one last look," she said. "A sentimental gesture, I suppose." Poirot turned then. The winter light through the tall windows struck green fire from his eyes. "Sentiment is not always weakness, mademoiselle. Sometimes it is the only honesty left." She gave a faint, humourless smile. "You sound almost as though you regret arresting me." "Regret? Non, but comprehension, yes. You are a woman who loves perfection. Lord Reginald threatened the most perfect thing you had ever seen. In your mind, the choice was simple: one man's life or 5 centuries of beauty. Many philosophers would have agreed with you. But not Hercule Poirot. But not Hercule Poirot, he echoed quietly. For me, the equation is always the same. A human soul is worth more than any object, however exquisite. She looked past him to the tapestry. And now it will go to a museum. Behind glass. Children will run past it without seeing. Tourists will photograph it with flash. Is that better? Perhaps not, but it will survive, and survival is a kind of justice. They stood in silence for a long moment. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 9. Poirot reached into his overcoat pocket and drew out a small object wrapped in silk. He unfolded the cloth to reveal the Byzantine reliquary cross. Gold rubies, a fragment of dark wood at its heart. Elena's breath caught. I persuaded Inspector Leach to let me return it to its proper place before the tapestry leaves for London, Poirot said. A private ceremony, no photographers. He stepped forward, lifted the lower corner of the hanging, and with infinite care slipped the cross into the restored pocket. The tiny stitches, worked yesterday by the museum's conservator, closed over it like a secret hield. When he let the tapestry fall back, the weave was whole again. No scar, no rent, no trace of violence. Only the centuries looked down as they always had. Elena watched, eyes bright with unshed tears, the first he had ever seen from her. You did not have to do that, she whispered. Perhaps not, but I too love perfection. And this, he gestured to the tapestry, is perfect once more. A police matron appeared at the archway and coughed discreetly. Time, miss. Elena drew a long breath, then turned to Poirot, and, to his astonishment, bent and kissed his cheek. A cool, swift brush of lips that carried the faint scent of turpentine and tuberose. Thank you, little man, she said softly, for understanding, if not for forgiving. She walked away between the two women without looking back. Poirot remained alone in the hall. After a moment, he took from his waistcoat pocket a small gold watch, the one removed from Lord Reginald's wrist. On the back were the engraved initials E.C. He turned it over once, twice, then laid it gently on the console table beneath the tapestry, exactly where a shaft of winter sunlight struck it full. A farewell, perhaps, or a restitution. Colonel Bantry found him there 10 minutes later. Car's ready, old chap. Thought you'd want to catch the London train with the rest of us. Poirot nodded. He gave the tapestry one final glance, smoothed his moustaches, and adjusted his Homburg to the perfect angle. As they walked together, down the steps to the waiting rolls, Bantry cleared his throat. Never asked you properly, Poirot. What decided you it was the girl, and not Victor alone? Poirot paused on the gravel, breath pluming in the cold air. 3 things, mon ami. First, the spy hole was bored from the front of the tapestry, not the back. Only someone who intended to stand in the narrow space and watch could have done it. Victor had no need to watch. He believed himself the poisoner. Second, the cut that freed the relic was made with a short curved blade, a palette knife, not the penknife Victor carried. The angle of the slit proved it was done by a left-handed person. Victor is right-handed. And third, Poirot's eyes twinkled suddenly. Third, the Turkish cigarette end left burning in the library ashtray still had lipstick upon it. A very faint trace of Russian red. Mademoiselle Voss affected that shade. Victor did not. Bantry gave a bark of laughter that turned into something suspiciously like a sob. Damned if I'll ever underestimate a woman again. "Wise," said Poirot. The rolls purred down the drive between the skeletal oaks. In the great hall behind them, the fire had burned itself to embers. The tapestry hung in perfect silence, keeping its ancient secret once more. And if, in the restored pocket behind the dying stag, the little gold cross now lay beside a single crimson thread deliberately left loose, a thread that had once been stained with real blood and real guilt, no one would ever know except two people. One who would carry the knowledge to her grave in Holloway Prison, and one small Belgian with very fine moustaches, who believed that even the most intricate weave could, in the end, be mended by a single perfect stitch. Chapter 10. Reflections in the Hall. The train from Shrewsbury to London was almost empty. A thin, reluctant January sun slanted through the frost-laced windows of the first-class carriage, striking pale fire from the silver coffee-pot on the table between Poirot and Colonel Bantry. The Colonel had insisted on travelling with him as far as Wolverhampton. He claimed he could not bear the thought of returning to his regiment's club and answering questions just yet. Poirot sipped his chocolate, thick, dark, exactly as he liked it, and gazed at the winter fields sliding past. Here and there a frozen pond flashed like a broken mirror. "You are quiet, mon colonel," he observed at last. Bantry stirred, thinking about the girl and the boy. Damned waste, the whole thing. Waste? Poirot set down his cup with precision. Perhaps. Yet consider. Lord Reginald died trying to right an old wrong. Victor will live, in prison, yes, but alive, and perhaps one day understand what he threw away. Elena Voss saved the tapestry she loved more than life, and will pay the precise price she always knew she would pay. There is balance, even in tragedy. Bantry grunted. You Belgians have a cold way of looking at things. Poirot's smile was small and wintry. We have seen too much not to be cold, mon ami. But cold does not mean without feeling, only without illusion. He drew from his pocket a folded sheet of heavy cream paper, the Blackwood crest at the top, and laid it on the table. This arrived by the morning post, forwarded from my flat. Bantry glanced at the single line of handwriting. The stag is at peace, thank you! E.V., below the initials in the margin, Elena had drawn a tiny perfect sketch. The woven hound whose flank had borne the wound. Now the wound was closed, the threads rewoven so cunningly that only someone who knew where to look would ever find the place. Bantry stared at it for a long time. She did it from memory, he said wonderingly, in a prison cell. Memory is the one thing they cannot take from her, Poirot replied. And perfection, once achieved, belongs to the ages. He refolded the letter and returned it to his pocket. At Wolverhampton the Colonel rose, awkward in his farewell. Care for a whisky at the club when you're next in town? Perhaps, Poirot said, knowing he would not. Bantry hesitated. You'll be all right, old chap, after all this. Poirot's eyes twinkled. My friend, Hercule Poirot, is always all right. It is the world that sometimes requires adjustment. The Colonel managed a crooked grin, saluted with 2 fingers to his hat, and was gone. The train gathered speed toward London. Poirot took out his little leather notebook and turned to a fresh page. With his neat continental handwriting, he wrote, Case of the Blackwood Tapestry Murderer. Elena Irina Voss, Principal. Accomplice, Victor Hargrove, accessory before and after. Motive, preservation of a masterpiece, greed. Method, hydrocyanic acid in brandy. Tableau arranged behind Flemish tapestry. Outcome, justice served, artifact preserved, one soul redeemed too late. He paused, then added a final line. Note, Even the most intricate weave may be mended if one is willing to find the single thread that holds the pattern true. He closed the notebook, smoothed his moustaches, and gazed out at the approaching city. In the great hall of Blackwood Manor, now empty save for dust and memory, the tapestry hung in its accustomed place. The restorers would come next week to crate it for the Victoria and Albert. But for a few days more, it remained where it had watched 5 centuries of birth, marriage, and death. Sunlight, rare and golden for January, struck through the high windows at noon and lit the woven stag as though it breathed. For an instant, the tiny cross hidden in its eye flashed like a living spark. Then the light moved on, and the hall settled back into silence. But those who passed beneath it in the years to come, scholars, tourists, children on school outings, would sometimes pause, puzzled by a faint warmth they felt in that corner of the gallery. A warmth no winter could quite dispel. They would never know that 2 murderers, 1 small detective, and an old soldier haunted by Flanders mud had, between them, stitched something more lasting than gold, or rubies into the ancient cloth. A single, perfect stitch of atonement. And that, thought Hercule Poirot, as the train steamed beneath the great glass arch of Paddington, was perhaps the only kind of happy ending this sad world ever truly allows.